Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. There's been a story in the last week, and you can see it on my blog, about a group which is taking the federal government to court in Ontario over the electoral system and trying to claim that it violates charter rights and so on. And it's nonsense, but it's one of these stories that kind of got me thinking about other ways in which people start turning to the courts when they lose at politics. And one of those is around the environment. And there is another court case happening, which has gone through a bunch of pretrial motion stuff lately, but it's a group which purports to be a bunch of youths, even though it's really a bunch of grown-ups using these youths as kind of their face, trying to challenge the federal government around things like climate change. And by having a front group of youth saying, you know, this is our future and you're violating it and so on, it's another way of trying to, again, turn to the courts when you lose at politics because things aren't happening fast enough for them. And it's one of these areas where I think we aren't really having enough of a discussion about what this is trying to accomplish. Because we have to kind of keep in mind about what the courts can actually order in terms of a remedy. It's all well and good for the court to say, okay, we're not addressing climate change fast enough, but that means nothing when it comes to the capacity challenges of a government, the ability to negotiate agreements with provinces and territories, the difficulty in setting up different systems for regulating certain kinds of emissions, that kind of thing. And you can't really have a court coming in and saying, these are the policies that you should be enacting in order to combat climate change, because that the court doesn't have that capacity or really that kind of specialization of knowledge or of public policy in order to make these kinds of pronouncements. So when you're turning to the courts to say, well, the government isn't moving fast enough or isn't doing it in the way that we would like, there's a problem there because of the limit of what just the role of the court is supposed to be in this kind of a situation. Now, the federal government did in a piece of legislation in the last year create a right to a healthy environment as part of it. And that's, again, one of these things where that creates a legal framework by which the courts could impose some kind of I'm not even sure how they would do that, though. But it's supposed to, create some kind of an impetus for governments to ensure that they are acting with this in mind. But again, when you are turning to the courts for a remedy in this kind of a case, what exactly are they able to offer in terms of a remedy when it comes to your right to a healthy environment being violated? And in this case, it could be slightly more specific in terms of clean water or uncontaminated soil or so on, in whatever it is that you're, or in your living situation or whatever that could be how it gets interpreted. It's still early days. We don't have a lot of jurisprudence around that just yet. That's going to be something that the courts are going to have to figure out over the coming years once this starts taking shape in the legislative and legal framework. But again, it's one of these things where we need to think about, is this something the court should be doing? And it's one of these things where I don't know that enough people really think about what it is the courts do and what limits the courts have when it comes to what they can order in these kinds of a situation. And that's kind of why I find these particular lawsuits, like this one from this supposed group of youths, kind of hard to take, because if they are successful in saying, yes, the federal government has not done enough to combat climate change, what then? The court can't simply say you need to reduce emissions by X amount, because how? How do they force a government to do that? It becomes a real challenge in terms of how to turn that into public policy. And I don't know that enough people necessarily understand what kind of a challenge that actually is. We'll get people who say things like, well, you need to follow the science, but science is not public policy. Science is a process. Science is not a definitive answer to everything. And so it's hard to just say, well, in order to combat climate change, we need to follow the science. What does that actually mean? It's kind of one of those cliched lines that does not translate into how governments work. And it's something we need to keep in mind when we see stories like this, or when people go to court to challenge government policies like this, because there is not a lot that can actually, what your outcome is going to be constrained by what a court can do and how a government can respond to a court like that, or court decision like that. So it's one of these things that when we see groups who go to court, like I say, to challenge when they lose at politics, it becomes kind of a problem in terms of people using their time and energy and resources to fight the wrong battle in the wrong way. They could be using it to, do what you should be doing, which is political organizing, building coalitions, doing the kind of groundwork that forces governments to pay attention. But they don't do that. They go through the courts instead, because they think that is going to somehow force a government's hand, even though, like we said, what remedy a court can offer is not necessarily going to be something that is achievable on the way in which governments work. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter, and journodale _, on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.